The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like a shroud, as if nature itself understood the gravity of what had transpired within these walls. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, Queen of the United Kingdom and 15 Commonwealth realms, sat motionless in her private study, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The room, usually filled with the steady rhythm of royal business, now held only silence broken by the distant chiming of the castle bells. She had not moved from this chair for 3 hours. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing minute with mechanical precision, a sound that had once comforted her but now seemed to mock the stillness of her heart. Outside her window, the grounds of Windsor stretched endlessly, the same grounds where she and Philip had walked countless times, discussing matters of state, family concerns, and the simple pleasures that made their extraordinary lives bearable. The Queen's private secretary had knocked twice, each time receiving only silence from within. The household staff moved about their duties with unusual quiet, their footsteps muffled on the ancient carpets as if any sound might shatter something precious and irreparable. Even the corgis, usually so full of energy and demanding attention, lay quietly by the fireplace, sensing that something fundamental had changed in their world. Elizabeth's gaze remained fixed on a photograph that sat prominently on her desk, taken during their honeymoon at Broadlands in 1947. Philip's young face smiled back at her, full of the confidence and humor that had first captured her heart when she was just a teenager. His naval uniform was crisp and perfect, his posture straight and proud. She remembered how nervous she had been that day, not because of the cameras or the formality, but because she couldn't quite believe that this remarkable man had chosen to bind his life to hers. The weight of the morning's events pressed down upon her like a physical force. She had been by his side when it happened, holding his hand as the monitors finally fell silent. For 99 years, Philip had defied expectation, challenged convention, and lived life entirely on his own terms. Even in his final moments, there had been a dignity about him that spoke to the strength that had sustained him through decades of public service and private sacrifice. The knock on the door came again, gentler this time but more persistent. She recognized the pattern: 3 soft raps, a pause, then 2 more. It was Charles. Her eldest son had developed this particular knock during his childhood, a private signal between them that meant he needed her attention for something important. How many times had she heard that same rhythm over the years? During his school troubles, his romantic heartbreaks, his struggles to find his place in a world that seemed to expect everything from him while offering little in return. "Mother?" His voice came through the heavy oak door, careful and concerned. "May I come in?" For a moment, she considered remaining silent, allowing herself just a few more minutes of this strange suspended state where grief had not yet demanded its full due. But Charles was grieving too, she realized. Philip had been not just his father but his guide through the complexities of royal duty, his example of how to serve something larger than oneself while maintaining personal integrity. "Enter," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she had expected. The door opened slowly, and Charles appeared, still dressed in the dark suit he had worn to the hospital hours earlier. His face bore the weight of exhaustion and sorrow, but there was something else there too, a gentle determination that reminded her powerfully of his father. He had inherited Philip's strong jaw and his way of carrying responsibility without complaint, though Charles wore his burdens more openly than Philip ever had. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment, as if uncertain whether to approach. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the silver in his hair, reminding Elizabeth that her son was no longer young himself. At 72, Charles had spent most of his life waiting, preparing for a role that would define not just his future but the future of the institution they both served. "The staff are asking about arrangements," he said carefully, moving closer but not presuming to sit without invitation. "The Prime Minister's office has called several times. The Archbishop is standing by." Elizabeth nodded slowly. Of course, there would be arrangements. Philip's death, like everything else in their lives, would become a matter of state protocol, public mourning, and carefully orchestrated ceremony. Even in grief, duty called. She had known this day would come, had prepared for it intellectually, but the emotional reality of it felt vastly different from any planning could have anticipated. "Yes," she said simply. "Of course." Charles moved to the chair across from her desk, the same chair Philip had occupied during their private conversations. For decades, her husband had sat there offering counsel, sharing concerns, sometimes simply providing the comfort of companionship during the lonely burden of monarchy. Seeing Charles in that position felt both natural and strange, as if the very furniture understood that a transition was taking place. "There's no rush," Charles said gently. "The world can wait a few more hours." This simple statement, this small rebellion against the machine of royal protocol, touched something deep within Elizabeth's carefully controlled composure. How like his father Charles could be, she thought, finding ways to assert humanity within the constraints of duty. Philip had done the same thing countless times, creating moments of privacy and authenticity within lives lived almost entirely in public view. She looked at her son more carefully, seeing past the formal exterior to the man beneath. Charles had always been sensitive, perhaps too sensitive for the role that awaited him. Where Philip had possessed a natural armor against criticism and controversy, Charles seemed to feel every slight, every criticism, every failure to live up to impossible expectations. Yet here he was, putting aside his own grief to care for hers. "He was proud of you, you know," she said suddenly, the words emerging without conscious decision. "He didn't always express it well, but he was." Charles's composure wavered slightly, a flicker of emotion crossing his features before he regained control. Philip had been a demanding father, holding his children to the highest standards and rarely offering the kind of open affection that might have made their relationships easier. But Elizabeth had seen the pride in her husband's eyes when he spoke of Charles's work, his environmental initiatives, his dedication to causes others might dismiss as unimportant. "He had a funny way of showing it sometimes," Charles replied with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But I think I understood. The role doesn't leave much room for sentiment." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in memories of the man who had shaped their lives in ways both seen and unseen. Philip's influence extended far beyond the public ceremonies and official duties. He had been the one to insist on modernizing certain aspects of royal protocol, the one who had pushed for greater efficiency in the household, the one who had quietly supported Elizabeth through every crisis and challenge of her long reign. The Queen's mind wandered to their early years together, when Philip had given up his naval career to support her unexpected ascension to the throne. He had been just 31 years old, at the height of his own promising military career, when duty to the crown had demanded everything of him. She had never asked him to make that sacrifice directly, but they both understood what was required. The crown demanded sacrifice not just from those who wore it, but from those who loved them. "I keep thinking about the coronation," she said suddenly. "Do you remember?" Charles nodded. He had been just 4 years old, but the memory remained vivid, the weight of the ceremony, the crowds, the sense that something momentous was happening that would define the rest of their lives. But mostly he remembered Philip, standing straight and proud, offering support to his wife as she accepted the burden that would define her existence. "He looked so handsome in his uniform," Elizabeth continued, her voice softer now. "So sure of himself, even though I know he was nervous about the whole thing. He hated ceremony for ceremony's sake, but he understood its importance." "He made it look easy," Charles observed. "Being second, I mean. Supporting without overshadowing. I always wondered how he managed it." Elizabeth considered this. Philip's role had indeed been unprecedented, there was no real template for being the husband of a reigning queen in the modern era. He had been forced to create his own way of serving, finding dignity in a position that many men might have found diminishing. It had required a particular kind of strength, one that was perhaps less obvious than the more traditional forms of power but no less remarkable. "He was never second in our marriage," she said firmly. "Different roles, but never second." This was true, though it was a truth known only to those closest to them. In public, protocol demanded certain formalities, but, in private, Philip had been her closest advisor, her strongest supporter, and often the only person willing to speak to her with complete honesty. He had possessed the rare ability to separate the woman from the crown, to see Elizabeth the person even when the rest of the world saw only the Queen. Charles stood and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds where Philip had spent so much time in recent years. The Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme, his environmental initiatives, his support for young people, all of these projects had grown from his restless energy and his need to find meaningful work within the constraints of his position. "The garden looks beautiful," Charles said. He would have been pleased. Philip had taken great pleasure in the Windsor gardens, spending hours planning improvements and modifications. It was one of the few areas where he had been allowed complete creative control, and he had used it well, creating spaces of beauty that would last long beyond his own lifetime. Like so much of what he had accomplished, it was a legacy that spoke quietly but enduringly. He was planning new plantings for the spring, Elizabeth said. He made notes, lists of what he wanted to try. The future tense felt strange now, these plans that would remain forever unrealized. Philip had always been a man of projects, of improvements, of constant forward motion. The idea that his energy, his planning, his restless intelligence had simply stopped seemed impossible to accept. A gentle knock interrupted their reverie, the private secretary again, no doubt with more questions that required immediate attention. The world outside would not pause for grief, no matter how profound. There would be statements to approve, schedules to adjust, protocols to follow. Death, even the death of someone so central to their lives, was just another event to be managed within the great machinery of monarchy. But, before Elizabeth could respond to the knock, Charles moved quickly to the door. "Another hour," he said firmly to whoever waited outside. "Her Majesty will be available in 1 hour." Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude for this small protection, this assertion of human need over institutional demand. It was exactly what Philip would have done, finding ways to shield her from the relentless pressure of duty when she needed time to simply be human. Charles returned to his chair, and they sat together in the strange intimacy of shared loss. Outside, the morning was advancing, bringing with it all the demands and expectations that would soon flood over them. But, for now, in this quiet room filled with memories, mother and son could simply mourn the man who had meant so much to them both. Elizabeth reached for the photograph on her desk, holding it carefully as if it might somehow bridge the impossible distance between past and present. Philip's young face smiled up at her, frozen in a moment when everything lay ahead of them, when the weight of years and responsibility had not yet settled upon their shoulders. "He lived a remarkable life," Charles said quietly. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "He did." And, in that simple acknowledgement, spoken in the morning light of Windsor Castle, began the slow process of learning to carry on without the man who had been the steady constant in both their lives for so many years. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the staterooms of Windsor Castle as Elizabeth finally emerged from her private study. She had spent another hour with Charles, discussing not the formal arrangements that protocol demanded, but the smaller, more personal details that only family could understand. They had talked about Philip's favorite foods, his private jokes, the way he had of humming tunelessly when he was particularly pleased about something. These memories seemed somehow more important than all the official tributes that would soon follow. Charles walked beside her now as she made her way through corridors she had traversed thousands of times. The familiar surroundings offered a kind of comfort, these walls that had sheltered generations of her family, that had witnessed celebrations and sorrows, triumphs and defeats. Windsor had always been Philip's favorite of the royal residences. Unlike Buckingham Palace, with its formal grandeur and constant flow of visitors, Windsor felt like home. Here, he could garden, he could read, he could simply be himself without the weight of constant public scrutiny. The castle staff they encountered along the way offered quiet bows and curtsies, their faces reflecting the same sense of loss that permeated the entire household. Many of these people had served the royal family for decades, had watched Philip age from the vigorous young man who had brought such energy to royal life into the distinguished elder statesman who still, even in his final years, could surprise everyone with his wit and wisdom. To them, he was not just the Duke of Edinburgh, but someone they had seen every day, someone whose moods and preferences they knew intimately. Elizabeth paused at the entrance to the oak drawing room, a space that held particular significance. This was where she and Philip had often entertained personal guests, away from the formal constraints of state entertaining. The room was filled with photographs, personal mementos, and furniture that told the story of their life together. Charles stood quietly beside her, understanding that she needed these moments to absorb the reality of what had happened. "Remember when he taught the grandchildren to sail?" Elizabeth said, her gaze settling on a photograph of Philip at the helm of a small yacht, surrounded by eager young faces. "He was so patient with them, even when they couldn't tie the knots properly or when they got seasick." Charles smiled at the memory. Philip's relationship with his grandchildren had been one of the great joys of his later years. Freed from some of the formal constraints that had shaped his interactions with his own children, he had been able to enjoy them more freely, to share his passions for sailing, carriage driving, and the outdoors. The grandchildren, in turn, had adored him, drawn to his energy and his refusal to treat them as anything other than ordinary young people who happened to live in extraordinary circumstances. "William was telling me just last month how much Papa had taught him about responsibility," Charles said. "Not through lectures, but through example. The way he approached every engagement, every duty, with complete commitment, regardless of how he might personally feel about it. This was Philip's greatest legacy, perhaps not any single achievement, but the consistent example of duty fulfilled with dignity. He had shown what it meant to serve something larger than oneself, to find meaning and satisfaction in work that might never bring personal recognition but that contributed to something important and lasting. In an age when public service often seemed to be viewed cynically, Philip had demonstrated that it was possible to dedicate one's life to others without losing one's integrity or sense of self. Elizabeth moved to a display case that contained some of Philip's naval medals and decorations. His war service had been distinguished, earning him recognition for bravery and leadership under fire. Yet he had rarely spoken of these experiences, treating them as simply part of his duty rather than occasions for pride or boasting. This modesty about his own achievements had been characteristic of his entire approach to life. He took satisfaction in work well done, but never felt the need to publicize or celebrate his accomplishments. The Navy meant so much to him, Elizabeth reflected. Even after he gave it up for the crown, he never stopped being a naval officer in his heart. Philip's decision to abandon his naval career had been one of the greatest sacrifices of his life, though he had never complained about it publicly. He had been on track for high command, perhaps even admiral of the fleet, when Elizabeth's unexpected accession to the throne had changed everything. The role of prince consort had no precedent in British history, no clear definition or established duties. Philip had been forced to create it from nothing, to find ways to serve that complemented rather than competed with the Queen's constitutional role. Charles understood something of this sacrifice, having himself given up military ambitions to focus on his role as heir to the throne. The military had offered both of them a clarity of purpose, a defined structure within which their abilities could be measured and recognized. Royal duty, by contrast, was often ambiguous, its successes difficult to quantify, its importance sometimes questioned by those who saw little value in constitutional monarchy. He never wanted to be idle, Charles observed. Even in his 80s, he was always looking for new projects, new ways to contribute. This restless energy had been one of Philip's most remarkable characteristics. While many people his age might have been content to retire to a comfortable obscurity, Philip had continued to take on new challenges, to learn new things, to push himself to grow and adapt. His environmental work, begun decades before it became fashionable, had demonstrated a forward-thinking approach that had sometimes put him ahead of public opinion. His support for young people through the Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme had touched millions of lives around the world. Elizabeth moved to the window, looking out over the private apartments where she and Philip had shared so many quiet evenings. They had established routines over the years, small rituals that had anchored their relationship amid the constant demands of public life. Evening drinks in the sitting room, reading together by the fire, Philip's running commentary on television programs that ranged from informed to hilariously irreverent. These private moments had sustained them through decades of public scrutiny and pressure. "I keep expecting to hear his voice," she admitted quietly. "He had opinions about everything, you know. The household arrangements, the staff schedules, the dog's behavior. Even when he wasn't directly involved in decisions, he always had something to say about how things might be improved." Philip's involvement in the practical aspects of royal life had been extensive and often unrecognized. He had modernized palace procedures, introduced new technologies, streamlined operations that had remained unchanged for decades. His engineering background had served him well in these efforts, bringing a logical, systematic approach to problems that had long been accepted as simply part of royal tradition. He had never been content to accept that something was done a certain way simply because it had always been done that way. Charles joined her at the window, both of them looking out at gardens that showed Philip's influence everywhere. He had been passionate about landscape design, spending hours planning improvements and modifications that would enhance both the beauty and functionality of the royal estates. These gardens would remain as a living testament to his vision and care, changing with the seasons but maintaining the essential character he had worked so hard to create. The funeral arrangements, Charles said carefully, knowing that the topic could not be avoided indefinitely. "Have you given thought to what he would have wanted?" Elizabeth nodded slowly. She and Philip had discussed these matters, of course, though neither had dwelt on the subject. Philip had been characteristically practical about death, viewing it as simply another aspect of life that required planning and preparation. He had expressed preferences for simplicity over grandeur, for personal meaning over public spectacle. The challenge would be balancing these wishes with the public's need to honor and remember a figure who had played such a significant role in national life. He wanted it to reflect his naval service, she said. And he was quite clear about not wanting excessive fuss. You know how he felt about unnecessary pomp. Philip's distaste for elaborate ceremony had been legendary, though he had understood and accepted its necessity in royal life. He had often joked that he was allergic to red carpets and gold braid, preferring the practical efficiency of military protocol to the ornate traditions of court ceremony. Yet when duty required it, he had played his part perfectly, understanding that these rituals served purposes larger than personal preference. The people will want to say goodbye, Charles pointed out gently. He meant a great deal to them, perhaps more than he realized. This was true, and Elizabeth knew it. Philip's public popularity had grown steadily over the years, as people came to appreciate his direct speaking style, his refusal to conform to expectations, and his obvious dedication to causes he believed in. His gaffes, once seen as embarrassing diplomatic mistakes, had come to be viewed as refreshing honesty in an age of careful political speech. The public had grown fond of his irreverence, his willingness to speak his mind regardless of who might be offended. Elizabeth turned away from the window and walked to a cabinet that contained some of Philip's personal effects. His reading glasses lay folded on top of a book he had been reading, a biography of a 19th-century naval explorer. Even in his final months, he had remained curious about the world, eager to learn new things and understand different perspectives. His intellectual appetite had never diminished, one of the qualities that had kept him vital and engaged well into his 90s. He was reading about Sir Ernest Shackleton, she noted, picking up the book carefully. He always admired explorers, people who pushed boundaries and refused to accept limitations. Philip had indeed been drawn to stories of exploration and adventure, perhaps seeing in them something that reflected his own journey from a relatively obscure European prince to one of the most recognized figures in the world. His own life had been, in many ways, an exploration of uncharted territory, creating a role that had never existed before, finding ways to serve that honored both his own abilities and the constitutional requirements of monarchy. Charles reached for another book from the stack, a technical manual on carriage driving. Even in his 80s, Philip had continued to compete in this demanding sport, refusing to give in to age or physical limitations. His competitive spirit had never dimmed, whether he was sailing, flying, or driving a carriage through challenging terrain. This determination to keep pushing himself had been an inspiration to everyone around him. "Remember when he broke his ribs in that carriage accident?" Charles said with a slight smile. The doctors told him to rest, and he was back driving within 2 weeks. Philip's relationship with physical risk had been complex. He was never reckless, but he was also never willing to be constrained by excessive caution. He approached dangerous activities with the same careful preparation he brought to everything else, but once that preparation was complete, he threw himself into them with complete commitment. This willingness to accept risk had sometimes worried those who cared about him, but it had also been essential to his sense of himself as a capable, autonomous individual. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside reminded them that the world was still waiting for their attention. Soon, there would be meetings with the Prime Minister, discussions with the Archbishop of Canterbury, decisions about guest lists and protocols and all the myriad details that a royal funeral required. But, for now, they were simply a mother and son, surrounded by reminders of someone they both loved and would miss terribly. Elizabeth returned to the photograph of Philip with the grandchildren, studying his face in the image. Even in this casual moment, captured during a family sailing trip, his essential character was visible, the alertness, the engagement, the sense that he was fully present in whatever he was doing. He had brought this quality to everything in his life, whether he was opening a hospital, discussing agricultural policy, or simply playing with his dogs in the garden. He lived every moment fully, she said quietly. Even the difficult ones. Even when duty required him to do things he didn't particularly enjoy, he gave his complete attention to them. This was perhaps the most valuable lesson Philip had taught, not through words but through example, that a life of service could be fulfilling, that duty and personal satisfaction were not necessarily incompatible, that it was possible to maintain one's integrity and individuality even while serving something larger than oneself. In an age when public service was often viewed with suspicion or cynicism, Philip had demonstrated that it was possible to dedicate one's life to others without losing one's sense of self. Charles moved to join her by the photograph, and together they stood in the gathering twilight, remembering a remarkable man whose influence on their lives and their understanding of duty would continue long after he was gone. Outside, the evening shadows were lengthening, but inside this room filled with memories, the presence of Philip's spirit seemed almost tangible, as if his energy and commitment had become part of the very fabric of the place he had called home. As evening descended upon Windsor Castle, Elizabeth found herself in the private sitting room where she and Philip had spent countless quiet hours together. The room felt different now, charged with an absence that seemed to press against the familiar furnishings. Charles had remained with her, understanding instinctively that this was not a time for solitude, that grief shared was somehow more bearable than grief endured alone. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with books that Philip had collected over the years. His reading tastes had been eclectic: military history, environmental science, biographies of inventors and explorers, technical manuals on everything from aircraft design to organic farming. These books told the story of a mind that had never stopped questioning, never stopped seeking to understand the world in all its complexity. Elizabeth settled into her usual chair, while Charles took the seat that had been Philip's domain for so many years. The arrangement felt both natural and strange, a small acknowledgement of how roles and relationships must now shift and adapt to new realities. The evening routine that had sustained her marriage for 7 decades would need to be reimagined, reconstructed around an absence that felt impossible to accept. The Prime Minister called again, Charles mentioned gently. "The entire government is standing by, waiting for your direction." Elizabeth nodded absently, her mind still processing the enormity of the change that Philip's death represented. He had been not just her husband but her closest advisor, the one person who could speak to her with complete honesty about the challenges facing the monarchy. His counsel had shaped countless decisions over the years, his wisdom helping her navigate crises that had tested both her personal resilience and the institution she served. He was always so practical about everything, she reflected. Even the most complex constitutional questions, he could find a way to cut through the complications and see the essential issue. Philip's mind had worked differently from most people in their circle. Where others might get lost in precedent and protocol, he focused on outcomes and effectiveness. His engineering background had taught him to approach problems systematically, to identify what needed to be accomplished and, then, work backward to find the most efficient path forward. This approach had sometimes put him at odds with traditional courtiers, but it had also led to innovations and improvements that had strengthened the monarchy's ability to serve effectively. Charles had witnessed this dynamic countless times over the years, watching his parents work through difficult decisions together. Philip's questions were often challenging, sometimes uncomfortable, but they forced examination of assumptions that might otherwise go unquestioned. He had never been content to accept that something was impossible simply because it had never been attempted before. "Remember the modernization of the coronation?" Charles asked. "Everyone said it couldn't be televised, that it would somehow diminish the mystery and dignity of the ceremony. Papa saw immediately that the opposite was true, that bringing people closer to the monarchy would strengthen it, not weaken it." This had been typical of Philip's forward-thinking approach to royal duty. While others worried about preserving traditions exactly as they had always been, he understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. His influence had been crucial in helping the institution maintain its relevance and connection to ordinary people's lives. The sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows created a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Philip had always loved stormy weather, finding energy and excitement in nature's dramatic displays. He would often stand at these same windows during thunderstorms, watching the lightning illuminate the castle grounds with an expression of pure enjoyment. His connection to the natural world had been deep and genuine, informing much of his environmental work and his passion for outdoor activities. Elizabeth rose and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens now barely visible in the evening darkness. During their walks together, Philip had shared his observations about seasonal changes, pointing out subtle signs that indicated the health of various plants and trees. His knowledge had been practical rather than academic, gained through years of hands-on experience and careful observation. He had taught her to see these gardens not just as beautiful spaces but as complex ecosystems that required understanding and careful management. "The roses will bloom soon," she said quietly. He planned a new bed near the east terrace specifically to extend the flowering season. He wanted to ensure there would always be color visible from the morning room windows. Such attention to detail had characterized everything Philip undertook. He approached even recreational projects with the same thoroughness he brought to official duties, researching extensively, consulting experts, and thinking through long-term implications. This comprehensive approach had made him an invaluable partner in managing the complex logistics of royal life. Charles joined her at the window, both of them looking out into the darkness that now concealed the familiar landscape. Tomorrow, this peaceful scene would be disrupted by the arrival of officials, media representatives, and all the apparatus that accompanied major royal events. The private grief they were experiencing would soon become public property, subject to scrutiny and interpretation by people who had never known Philip as anything more than a distant public figure. "How do we balance it?" Charles asked, voicing a concern that had been troubling him all day. "Honoring his memory publicly while protecting what was private and personal about him?" This question got to the heart of one of the monarchy's perpetual challenges: maintaining authenticity while fulfilling public expectations, preserving human dignity while accepting that royal lives belonged, in some sense, to the nation. Philip had struggled with this balance throughout his time as consort, sometimes chafing against the constraints that public life imposed, but ultimately finding ways to serve effectively without completely sacrificing his individuality. "He would want us to be honest," Elizabeth said after a long pause. "Not to create some sanitized version that bears no relation to who he really was. His strength came from his authenticity, from his refusal to pretend to be something he wasn't." Philip's public appeal had indeed rested largely on his genuineness. People had responded to his directness, his willingness to express opinions that others might keep diplomatic silence about, his obvious passion for the causes he supported. Even his occasional gaffes had been forgiven because they revealed someone who was real and human rather than carefully programmed. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Charles's private secretary appeared, carrying a leather folder that undoubtedly contained more documents requiring attention. The machinery of state and protocol continued to turn, regardless of personal grief or the desire for quiet reflection. "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb, but there are several matters that require urgent attention," the secretary said quietly. Charles looked to his mother, silently asking whether she was ready to engage with these practical demands. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders slightly, a gesture that had become automatic over decades of public service, a physical acknowledgement that duty was calling once again. "What cannot wait until tomorrow?" she asked, her voice regaining some of its usual authority. The secretary consulted his notes carefully. "The guest list for the funeral requires final approval, Your Majesty. Several foreign dignitaries have requested permission to attend, and the security implications need to be considered. Also, there are questions about the music selections and the order of service that the Archbishop hopes to resolve this evening." These details, mundane as they might seem, were actually crucial elements in creating a ceremony that would properly honor Philip's memory while serving the various needs of those who would participate. Elizabeth understood that getting these elements right was important not just for the immediate event but for how Philip would be remembered in the years to come. "Bring the guest list," she decided. "We'll review it now." As the secretary withdrew to fetch the necessary documents, Elizabeth returned to her chair with a sense of resolution. The time for private mourning would continue, but it would now need to be balanced with the public responsibilities that Philip's death had triggered. This balancing act was itself a tribute to him, a continuation of the approach to duty that had defined his entire adult life. Charles settled back into Philip's chair, accepting his role in this process with the same sense of responsibility that his father had brought to every challenge. The conversation that followed would involve practical decisions about protocol and logistics, but it would also be an opportunity to ensure that the public farewell to Philip reflected the essential qualities that had made him such a remarkable consort and such a beloved figure. "He hated fuss," Elizabeth remarked as they waited for the documents to arrive. "But he understood the importance of doing things properly when the occasion demanded it." This distinction had been crucial to Philip's approach to royal ceremonies. He had little patience for pomp that served no clear purpose, but he recognized that certain rituals carried important symbolic weight and deserved to be executed with precision and dignity. His naval background had taught him the value of ceremony when it served to honor service, sacrifice, or achievement. The secretary returned with the guest list, and Elizabeth began reviewing the names with the careful attention that such decisions required. Each invitation represented not just a personal gesture but a diplomatic statement, an indication of relationships and priorities that would be noted and analyzed by observers around the world. Philip would have approached this task with the same systematic thoroughness, considering not just who should be included but what messages their inclusion or exclusion might send. As they worked through the details, Charles found himself thinking about how naturally his mother had returned to this mode of careful decision-making. Her grief was real and profound, but it had not diminished her ability to fulfill the responsibilities that her position required. This resilience was something she had learned from Philip, who had demonstrated throughout his life that personal feelings, however strong, could not be allowed to interfere with duty properly executed. The evening stretched ahead of them, filled with decisions large and small that would shape how the nation and the world would say goodbye to a man who had served with such distinction for so many years. In making these choices, Elizabeth and Charles were not just planning a funeral but ensuring that Philip's legacy of dedicated service would be honored in a manner worthy of his remarkable contribution to British public life. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the gardens that Philip had loved, nourishing the plants and trees that would continue to flourish long after he was gone, a living testament to his care and vision. Inside the castle, the work of honoring his memory had begun, guided by the same principles of duty, dignity, and service that had defined his extraordinary life. The midnight hours found Elizabeth and Charles still in the sitting room, surrounded by documents and decisions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The funeral arrangements had grown from a simple family farewell into a complex state occasion that would require coordination between multiple government departments, security services, and religious authorities. Each detail demanded careful consideration, not just for its immediate practical implications but for what it would communicate about Philip's life and service. Elizabeth had insisted on being involved in every decision, rejecting suggestions from staff that she delegate the more mundane choices to others. This was her final act of partnership with Philip, her last opportunity to ensure that his preferences and values were properly reflected in how he would be remembered. Charles had watched his mother work through these decisions with the same methodical attention she had brought to 7 decades of public service, finding in the familiar rhythm of duty a kind of comfort amid her grief. "The Naval Guard of Honor," Elizabeth said, reviewing the ceremonial arrangements for the 100th time. Philip would have wanted them to be from HMS Excellent, where he completed his training. He always spoke fondly of his time there. These personal touches were what distinguished this funeral from a generic state occasion. Every choice reflected some aspect of Philip's character or interests, from the selection of hymns that honored his faith to the inclusion of representatives from the many organizations he had supported over the years. The challenge was weaving these individual elements into a coherent ceremony that would serve the broader needs of a nation in mourning. Charles had contributed his own memories and insights to the planning process, helping to ensure that the public ceremony would capture something of the private man that the world had rarely seen. Philip's sense of humor, his passion for innovation, his deep commitment to environmental conservation, these qualities needed to be acknowledged alongside the more formal aspects of his royal service. "What about the Duke of Edinburgh Award participants?" Charles suggested. He was so proud of that program, of how it had grown from a small experiment into something that touched young people's lives around the world. This had been one of Philip's most successful initiatives, a program that had evolved far beyond its original scope to become an internationally recognized framework for youth development. The award had reflected many of Philip's core beliefs, that young people needed challenges to grow, that service to others was essential to personal fulfillment, that physical activity and outdoor experiences were crucial for healthy development. Including award participants in the funeral would honor this legacy while involving the next generation that Philip had worked so hard to inspire and support. The conversations had continued long into the night, punctuated by calls from Downing Street, Lambeth Palace, and various diplomatic missions seeking clarification on protocols and arrangements. Each conversation required Elizabeth to shift from private grief to public responsibility, a transition she had made countless times over the years but which felt particularly difficult under these circumstances. "The Commonwealth representatives are asking about special recognition," Charles reported after taking yet another call. They want to acknowledge Papa's role in strengthening those relationships over the decades. Philip's work with the Commonwealth had been one of his most significant contributions to modern British diplomacy. He had understood instinctively that these relationships needed to evolve beyond their colonial origins, that they could become genuine partnerships based on shared values and mutual respect. His countless trips to Commonwealth countries, his genuine interest in their cultures and challenges, had helped transform what could have been a relic of empire into a vibrant association of independent nations. Elizabeth felt a surge of pride as she considered this aspect of Philip's legacy. He had been ahead of his time in recognizing that Britain's future lay not in trying to recreate past imperial glories but in building new kinds of relationships based on equality and shared interest. His approach to Commonwealth relations had been pragmatic rather than sentimental, focused on what these partnerships could accomplish rather than what they represented historically. He always said the Commonwealth was about the future, not the past, she reflected. He saw it as a laboratory for international cooperation, a place where different traditions and approaches could learn from each other. This forward-looking perspective had characterized much of Philip's approach to his royal duties. Where others might have been content to preserve traditions unchanged, he had constantly looked for ways to make institutions more effective and relevant. His innovations in palace management, his introduction of new technologies, his streamlining of ceremonial procedures, all of these changes had been guided by a vision of monarchy that served contemporary needs while honoring historical continuity. The clock chimed 2 a.m, but neither Elizabeth nor Charles showed any inclination to stop working. There was something therapeutic about this process of creating a fitting tribute to Philip, a way of channeling grief into purposeful action. Each decision was a small act of love, an opportunity to ensure that the man they had known privately would be properly honored publicly. The environmental organizations are requesting representation, Charles mentioned, consulting another stack of messages. WWF, the Conservation Foundation, the Countryside Trust, they all want to participate somehow. Philip's environmental work had been pioneering, beginning long before climate change and conservation became mainstream political issues. He had used his position to raise awareness about threats to wildlife, to promote sustainable practices, and to encourage young people to see themselves as stewards of the natural world. His passion for these causes had been genuine and informed, based on extensive reading and direct observation rather than fashionable political positions. Include them, Elizabeth decided without hesitation. His environmental legacy may be more important in the long run than many of his other achievements. He understood things about conservation and sustainability that most people are just beginning to appreciate. This decision reflected a broader theme in the funeral planning, the desire to acknowledge not just what Philip had accomplished in his lifetime but what his work might contribute to future generations. His ideas about education, his innovations in organizational management, his approach to youth development, these contributions would continue to influence people and institutions long after the immediate ceremonies were over. As dawn approached, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the private funeral that would follow the public ceremonies. This smaller service, for family and close friends only, would be where her personal grief could be more openly expressed. The public funeral was for the nation and the world, but the private service would be for the woman who had lost her husband of more than 70 years. "What will you miss most?" Charles asked quietly, sensing the direction of her thoughts. Elizabeth considered the question carefully, trying to find words for feelings that seemed too complex for language. Philip's absence would affect every aspect of her daily life, from the major decisions that required his counsel to the small domestic moments that had given structure and meaning to their shared existence. "His voice," she said finally. "The way he could make me laugh even when everything seemed impossible. The way he could ask the one question that cut through all the complexity to the heart of whatever problem we were facing." This capacity for clarity had been one of Philip's greatest gifts to the monarchy. In a world of competing advisors and conflicting opinions, he had provided a perspective that was both independent and deeply informed. His questions had often been uncomfortable, but they had forced examination of assumptions that might otherwise have gone unquestioned. Charles understood this quality in his father, having experienced it himself many times over the years. Philip's directness could be challenging, even painful, but it was always motivated by a desire to help people see situations clearly and respond effectively. His criticism came from love rather than judgment, from a belief that people could do better if they were honest about what improvement required. He made us all better, Charles observed. Not through flattery or false comfort, but by expecting the best from everyone around him. This expectation of excellence had extended to every aspect of Philip's own work. He had prepared thoroughly for every engagement, researched the organizations he visited, asked informed questions that demonstrated genuine interest in what people were trying to accomplish. His approach to royal duty had been professional in the best sense, treating every responsibility as worthy of his full attention and best effort. The first light of dawn was beginning to show outside the windows, marking the end of their long night of planning and the beginning of what would be an intense period of preparation for the funeral. Soon, the castle would come alive with activity as staff implemented the decisions that had been made during these quiet hours. Elizabeth rose from her chair and moved once more to the window, watching the garden emerge from darkness into the gentle light of early morning. Philip would have loved this view, would have been planning the day's activities, thinking about what needed to be done in the garden or what correspondence required attention. His energy and enthusiasm for each new day had been one of the qualities that had sustained their relationship through all the challenges and changes of their long life together. "He would want us to do this well," she said, turning back to Charles. "Not for our sake, but for the sake of everyone who will find comfort and inspiration in how we honor his memory." This perspective captured something essential about Philip's approach to public service, the understanding that individual actions carried significance beyond their immediate impact, that how things were done mattered as much as what was accomplished. The funeral would be judged not just as a ceremonial event but as a statement about values, about what the monarchy stood for and how it honored those who had served with distinction. Charles gathered the papers they had been reviewing, understanding that the formal decision-making process was now complete. The detailed work would continue throughout the coming days, but the essential character of the funeral had been established. It would be a ceremony that honored Philip's naval service, his environmental passion, his dedication to young people, and his lifelong commitment to supporting the Queen and the institution of monarchy. As they prepared to leave the sitting room where they had spent these crucial hours, Elizabeth paused for one last look around the space that held so many memories of evenings spent with Philip. The familiar furniture, the personal photographs, the books he had been reading, all of these would remain, but they would never again be part of the living relationship that had given them meaning. "Thank you for staying with me through this," she said to Charles, recognizing the gift of companionship during one of the most difficult nights of her life. "Where else would I be?" Charles replied simply, and, in that response, she heard an echo of the loyalty and dedication that Philip had shown throughout their marriage. Outside, Windsor Castle was awakening to a new day, a day that would bring fresh challenges and responsibilities. But the foundation for meeting those challenges had been laid during these quiet hours of planning and remembrance, guided by the same principles of duty and service that Philip had exemplified throughout his remarkable life. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Elizabeth prepared to face the first full day without Philip by her side. The night of planning and decision-making had provided a framework for moving forward, but now came the more difficult task of actually living within that new reality. Charles had remained close throughout the early hours, understanding that the transition from private grief to public duty would require careful navigation. The castle was already showing signs of the transformation that would take place over the coming days. Staff members moved with unusual urgency, telephone calls were being taken at all hours, and vehicles had begun arriving with officials who would coordinate the various aspects of the state funeral. Elizabeth watched this activity from her private apartments, recognizing the familiar rhythm of major royal events while understanding that this one carried a weight that was entirely personal. Her lady-in-waiting had laid out mourning clothes, the formal black attire that protocol required for royal bereavement. Elizabeth dressed with the same careful attention she brought to all her public appearances, understanding that every detail would be scrutinized and interpreted. Philip had always appreciated her attention to such matters, recognizing that the visual elements of monarchy carried messages that were sometimes more powerful than words. Charles appeared at the appointed time for their first official meeting of the day, dressed in the dark suit that would become his uniform for the coming weeks. Father and son had been transformed overnight into chief mourners for a nation, their private loss now inseparable from their public responsibilities. The breakfast they shared was subdued, marked more by practical discussions than by the easy conversation that had characterized their late-night planning session. "The Prime Minister will arrive at 10, Charles reported, consulting the schedule that had been prepared by their private secretaries. the Archbishop at 11. The Lord Chamberlain's office has prepared briefings on all the protocol questions. Elizabeth nodded, understanding that these meetings would establish the final details of arrangements that would soon become fixed and unchangeable. Once the official machinery was set in motion, there would be little room for second thoughts or modifications. Everything needed to be decided correctly the first time, a pressure that Philip would have understood and prepared for with characteristic thoroughness. The first meeting was with senior household staff, people who had served the royal family for decades and who understood the practical challenges of managing a major state event. These individuals had witnessed many royal ceremonies over the years, but none quite like this one, which needed to balance the formal requirements of a state funeral with the more personal elements that would honor Philip's individual character and achievements. The security arrangements are unprecedented, the master of the household reported. We're expecting representatives from over 100 nations, plus the domestic dignitaries and family members. The coordination with the police and military is complex. Elizabeth listened carefully to these briefings, asking the occasional question but mostly absorbing the information that would help her understand what the next few days would involve. Philip had always been fascinated by the logistics of major events, appreciating the planning and coordination required to make complex ceremonies appear effortless to those who attended them. The meeting with the Prime Minister covered the political and diplomatic aspects of the funeral arrangements. Foreign dignitaries would need to be received and honored according to their status and the relationship between their countries and Britain. These protocols existed for good reasons, but they could sometimes conflict with personal preferences or practical considerations. His Royal Highness specifically requested that the guest list reflect his international interests, Elizabeth reminded the Prime Minister. The Commonwealth representatives, the environmental organizations, the youth program participants, these groups were as important to him as any head of state. This balance between official protocol and personal meaning would characterize many of the decisions that needed to be finalized. Philip's funeral could not be merely a gathering of dignitaries paying respects to a royal consort, it needed to acknowledge the full scope of his interests and commitments, the diverse communities he had served and inspired over 7 decades of public life. The Archbishop's visit addressed the religious and ceremonial elements of the service. Philip's faith had been genuine but undogmatic, characterized more by practical service than by theological speculation. The funeral service needed to reflect this approach, honoring his beliefs while avoiding the kind of elaborate religious ceremony that he had often found tedious. He wanted the service to be accessible, Elizabeth explained to the Archbishop. Not simplified, but meaningful to people regardless of their own religious background. He believed faith should unite people rather than divide them. This ecumenical approach had characterized much of Philip's public service, his willingness to engage with people of all backgrounds and beliefs while maintaining his own principles and convictions. The funeral service would need to capture this inclusive spirit while still providing the sense of significance and solemnity that such an occasion required. By mid-afternoon, the essential decisions had been made and the implementation process had begun. Elizabeth found herself with a rare moment of quiet, a brief respite before the evening's scheduled activities. She used this time to walk alone through the castle, visiting spaces that held particular memories of her life with Philip. The Queen's Gallery displayed some of Philip's favorite paintings, works he had personally selected for their artistic merit rather than their historical significance. His taste had been eclectic but informed, reflecting extensive reading and thoughtful consideration rather than conventional royal preferences. He had enjoyed discussing these works with visitors, often surprising them with his knowledge and insights about artistic techniques and historical context. Elizabeth paused before a landscape painting that Philip had acquired during their Silver Jubilee year. He had been drawn to the artist's unusual technique for capturing light, spending considerable time studying how the effects had been achieved. This curiosity about craftsmanship and technique had extended to every area of his interests, from sailing to conservation to youth development. He had never been content to be merely a patron, he had always wanted to understand how things worked and how they might be improved. The private chapel held even deeper memories, the site of countless family services and personal moments of reflection. Philip's faith had been practical rather than mystical, expressed more through service than through contemplation. He had seen religious obligation as inseparable from social responsibility, believing that true faith required action in the world rather than withdrawal from it. Elizabeth knelt briefly in the pew where she and Philip had sat together for so many services over the years. The familiar surroundings provided a sense of continuity and peace, a reminder that some things endured beyond individual loss. The institution of monarchy, the values it represented, the service it provided to the nation, these would continue, guided by the same principles that Philip had helped to define and strengthen. As evening approached, Elizabeth returned to the private apartments where Charles was waiting with additional updates on the funeral preparations. The international response had been overwhelming, with messages of condolence arriving from leaders around the world who had known and respected Philip personally. These tributes spoke to the genuine relationships he had built over decades of diplomatic travel and engagement. The Duke of Edinburgh Award participants want to hold their own memorial service, Charles reported. Young people from all over the Commonwealth, gathering to share stories about how the program changed their lives. This response reflected one of Philip's most significant legacies, the impact he had made on individual lives through programs and initiatives that encouraged personal growth and service to others. The award scheme had reached millions of young people, providing them with challenges and opportunities that many might never have encountered otherwise. This grassroots tribute was perhaps more meaningful than any official ceremony could be. The evening brought telephone calls from other family members, each dealing with their own grief while preparing to participate in the public farewell that would take place in just a few days. William and Harry called to share memories and discuss their roles in the service, their voices reflecting the deep affection they had felt for their grandfather and their determination to honor his memory appropriately. "Papa taught us that duty and fun weren't opposites," William observed during his call. "He showed us that service could be joyful, that taking responsibility for others could be one of life's greatest satisfactions." This lesson had been one of Philip's most important contributions to the younger generation of royals. He had demonstrated that public service, while demanding and sometimes difficult, could also be deeply fulfilling when approached with the right attitude and commitment. His example had shaped their understanding of what royal duty could be at its best. As the day drew to a close, Elizabeth found herself once again in the sitting room where she and Philip had spent so many evenings together. The familiar surroundings now carried a different weight, charged with memory and loss, but also with the recognition that life continued, that responsibilities remained to be fulfilled regardless of personal circumstances. Charles joined her for a quiet dinner, both of them understanding that these private moments would become increasingly rare as the funeral preparations intensified. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more decisions, more demands on their time and attention. But tonight, they could simply be a mother and son sharing a meal and remembering someone they both loved. "He would be proud of what we've planned," Charles said as they finished eating. "It honors everything he stood for while serving the needs of everyone who will participate." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a sense of completion about the planning process. The ceremony would not be perfect, no human endeavor ever was, but it would be sincere, meaningful, and true to Philip's character and values. That was perhaps the best tribute they could offer, not perfection, but authenticity and genuine care in honoring his memory. Outside, the lights of Windsor Castle twinkled in the darkness, the same lights that Philip had seen countless times during their years together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but the foundation had been laid for meeting them with the same grace and dedication that Philip had demonstrated throughout his remarkable life. The castle settled into evening quiet, but the preparations continued in offices and workshops throughout the building. Seamstresses worked on ceremonial banners, florists planned elaborate arrangements, musicians rehearsed compositions that would honor Philip's memory. All of these efforts were coordinated by the same sense of purpose that had motivated Philip's own service, the understanding that excellence in small details contributed to something larger and more lasting than any individual contribution. As Elizabeth prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's accomplishments and the challenges that lay ahead. The first full day without Philip had been survived, not just endured but navigated with purpose and dignity. The example he had set, the values he had embodied, the love he had shared, these would continue to guide her through whatever came next. Outside her window, the gardens that Philip had loved lay peaceful in the moonlight, ready to bloom again with the spring flowers he had planned but would never see. Yet in some sense, he would see them, through the eyes of those who had learned from him to appreciate beauty, to value service, and to find joy in duty well performed.